People never look close enough until it's already too late. Some lists carry more than groceries. They carry ghosts. Let us know in the comments if you've ever seen something ordinary become unforgettable. George Beckett folded the paper 3 times before tucking it into the front pocket of his flannel shirt. His fingers moved with the slow precision of someone who'd done this hundreds of times, maybe thousands, and still gave it the same quiet respect. The list didn't look like much, just names, all in the same neat handwriting that had started to shake only in the last few years. He walked with a stiff limp, not the kind people notice right away, but the kind that comes from decades of quietly adjusting to pain that never left. His boots, polished even after all these years, clicked softly on the tile floor of Harper's Market. He made the same stops each week. A carton of eggs, a loaf of rye bread, coffee grounds, always dark roast, and at the end of every trip he would hand Maggie Rowe the paper from his front pocket and say the same thing. "Could you check if these are in stock today?" She always took it from him with a polite nod, never asking questions, always typing into her little monitor with a glance toward the back room. But today, Maggie wasn't at the counter. Instead, Officer Dillon Merritt stood leaning against the customer service desk, sipping from a plastic cup of cold brew and scrolling on his phone with his free hand. His navy Puel code enforcement uniform looked 2 sizes too crisp, as if still clinging to the packaging it came in. He looked up the moment George walked in. "Morning, sir," Dillon said with the kind of detached friendliness reserved for old men and unpaid parking tickets. George gave a nod, the same silent one he gave to everyone he didn't recognize. "You headed toward the dairy aisle?" Dillon asked, pushing off the desk. "Or just here to check the local bulletin board again?" He laughed, as if that were a joke he'd earned the right to make. George didn't answer. He moved past him, placing a basket into the crook of his arm and heading down the first aisle. The list was still in his shirt pocket. Dillon watched him for a beat, then turned to the clerk stepping up behind the counter. "Hey, isn't that the guy with the weird grocery list?" Shannon, the new girl, barely out of high school, gave a quick glance toward George's back. "Yeah, I think so. Maggie always checks it for him. I think it's just names, like first names only. Real old-fashioned." Dillon raised an eyebrow. "You ever seen it?" "No." "Maggie says it's private." "Private list at a public grocery store." "Classic," Dillon muttered, grinning. "You know what? I'll go check what he's got this time." He moved down the aisle, quiet and casual, watching George select a can of beans with deliberate care. As George turned toward the bakery section, Dillon followed just long enough to spot the corner of the paper sticking out of George's pocket. It was too easy. By the time George reached the counter 20 minutes later with his items neatly arranged, Maggie was back, but she looked pale. Too pale. He handed her the list. She took it wordlessly, but the paper trembled slightly in her hand. Dillon stood just behind her, now joined by 2 young men in contractor uniforms, clearly off-duty and killing time in the air conditioning. "This it?" one of them asked, snorting. Dillon nodded. "Check out the names. Thought it was a shopping list. Turns out it's more like a roster." The contractor tilted his head. "Hank, Leon, Mikey, JP? Man, is this guy trying to start a softball team?" They all laughed, except Maggie. George stood there, not moving, his expression unchanged. Maggie opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Instead, she folded the list back up slowly and handed it back to George with both hands. We're out of a few things today, Mr. Beckett. I'll let you know when they come in." He nodded once, took his change, and walked out without another word. Outside, the heat clung to his skin, but he didn't hurry. He never did. His pickup sat 2 blocks down, parked next to the Memorial Garden on Center Street. He always parked there, even if it meant walking farther. The plaque out front bore the names of every soldier from the county who died in the line of duty. George sat on the edge of the truck bed, unfolded the paper again, and looked at the list. One name caught his eye this time, one that never stopped catching his eye. Leon "Skip" Mathers. Skip had been the loudest in their platoon. always writing home to his sister about the stupidest things: canned peaches, hot showers, a dog named Tractor that followed him on patrol once. George stared at the name for a moment longer, then folded the paper back up and tucked it away. The paper wasn't a grocery list. It was a weekly roll call, and every week he read their names as if they were still waiting to be accounted for. The mocking laughter followed George Beckett long after he left Harper's Market. Not loud enough to echo down Main Street, but it stayed lodged in the back of his skull like shrapnel, quiet, sharp, and slow to dig out. He didn't look back. Didn't need to. At 74, he had become fluent in the art of invisibility, at least until someone decided to notice the odd old man with the limp and a list. The Ford pickup grumbled to life beneath his steady hand. It was a sound he trusted, even more than the people he passed on the road home. Back at his house, nestled at the end of Walnut Creek Road, George didn't unpack the groceries right away. He took the list from his shirt pocket again, smoothing it on the kitchen table as if it were made of linen and not wrinkled store-band paper. His fingers traced the ink, one name at a time. Some had started to fade. Others he had rewritten more than once, afraid of forgetting the shape of the letter. He lit the stove, placed the old kettle on top, and waited. The house creaked around him, the walls seasoned by years of silence and repetition. Every floorboard knew his weight. Every window carried the reflections of the men whose names he still remembered, better than he remembered his own nephew's birthday or where he'd last put the TV remote. It was Maggie's eyes that stuck with him more than Dylan's laughter. There had been something in them, not pity, something closer to a crack forming in the glass. A realization just beginning to surface. By the time the kettle whistled, he'd made a decision. The names couldn't just be names anymore. If they were going to be mocked, let them be seen for who they were. Not initials, not first names, the whole of them. He took the paper and a fresh sheet from the drawer. At the top, in heavier ink, he wrote, "In memory of..." Then it began. E.T. Henry Hank Meadows, KIA, Fubai, 1969. PFC Leon Skip Mathers, IED Strike, Highway QL-19. Miguel Alvarez, Friendly Fire, Quantum Province. SPC Joseph J.P. Blanchard, Leku, 4 down, 12 to go. He hadn't forgotten a single one. Meanwhile, back at Harper's Market, Maggie Rose stood at the time clock, arms folded tight, watching the numbers blink to 4:00 p.m. She hadn't said anything when Dylan made his wisecracks, but the weight of it hung on her chest like a too-heavy winter coat. She had seen the list. She had read enough of the names. Something about it didn't sit right, and she knew where she'd seen them before. That old bronze memorial at Center Street, the one she passed every day on her way to work without really looking. She decided then and there to stop by, before going home. 10 minutes later, she parked across the street from the memorial garden. The late afternoon light cast long shadows from the flagpole. There it was, dedicated to the fallen heroes of Harlan County. She walked up the path slowly, eyes scanning the engraved names. Ha! Hank Meadows, Leon Mathers, Joseph Blanchard. Her breath caught. There they were, exactly as she remembered seeing them in the list George had handed her, written with that same careful, reverent script. "Oh, my God," she whispered, her hand going to her mouth. These weren't groceries. These were ghosts. She pulled out her phone and took a photo of the plaque. Then, in a sudden moment of urgency, she opened the Notes app and typed out the names she could remember from the list. She needed to do something, but what? Later that evening, across town, Dylan Merritt reclined on his couch with a slice of takeout pizza balanced on a paper plate and his feet kicked up on the coffee table. He scrolled through local posts on social media, a habit he'd picked up since taking the city job, see what people were complaining about, who was arguing about potholes, what HOA was mad about whose bushes. He almost skipped over Maggie's post. It was a simple photo, the Center Street Memorial, followed by a caption that read, Sometimes the names we overlooked belong to those who never got the chance to come home. Today I learned I was laughing at a list of heroes. I won't make that mistake again. It had no hashtags, no filters, just that. But already the comments were piling up. Wait, is this about Mr. Beckett? I see Hank Meadows' name. He was my uncle. He died in Vietnam. That's the guy who always parks by the memorial. I thought he was just a weirdo. He's not a weirdo. He's a damn hero keeper. Dylan's stomach twisted. He didn't say anything. Not online, not to anyone. Instead, he tossed the crust of his pizza in the trash and sat in silence, wondering if tomorrow morning he'd see George again, and what the hell he was supposed to say if he did. The next morning, George rose before the sun. He dressed in the same routine, stiff jeans, flannel shirt, military boots, laced with the same method he'd used in '68. The list was now 2 pages long, rewritten in full. He didn't tuck it away this time. He placed it carefully in a clear plastic sleeve like something you'd find in a museum display. And instead of driving to Harper's Market, he walked to Center Street. The dew clung to the grass around the memorial. He arrived before the city was properly awake, before coffee shops opened, before school buses warmed up their engines. He taped the list to the side of the memorial with gentle care, securing each corner. And then he sat on the bench beside it. By 7:00 a.m., the first passerby slowed. A jogger. She stopped mid-stride, eyes on the list, breath hitching. By 8:00 a.m., 3 more people had come by. One of them brought a folding chair, another a bouquet of flowers. By 10:00 a.m., a local reporter had posted a live feed. By noon, the mayor's office called. But George never looked at his phone, never checked the news. He just sat there, hands folded, watching as the town he once served finally stopped long enough to read the names he never forgot. By the 3rd day, the list was laminated and reprinted in bold, easy-to-read letters. Someone had added a small wooden stand beneath it, carved with the words, "Honor where it's due." No one confessed to building it, but George suspected it was someone from the VFW. They wouldn't say it aloud, but they had seen him, sitting at the memorial, his hands resting calmly in his lap, nodding now and then when people stopped to ask a question or just say thank you. He wasn't there to talk. He was there to bear witness. People came and went, some took photos, others left flowers or medals or coins. One little boy asked if George had known a man named Skip, because that was his great-uncle's name, and he'd heard stories about him in the family. George only nodded and said he could make anyone laugh, even in the worst places on earth. That was all he needed to say. By Friday, it had spread. Local news picked up the story first. Veterans' grocery list turns out to be memorial to fallen soldiers. Then regional. By Saturday morning, George's porch was lined with folded flags, notes from strangers, and even a reporter from a military magazine who politely asked for an interview. George said no. He didn't want his face on the internet. The list wasn't about him. But one visitor changed everything. General Raymond Maddox arrived in a black government SUV that stopped just past the memorial, its flag mount catching the light. The man who stepped out was in his late 60s, full suit, clean medals, posture like an oak tree. People turned to look. Even the ones who didn't know his name recognized the air of authority that came off him like heat from sun-baked concrete. He approached George quietly. No entourage, no announcement. George looked up. Didn't smile. Didn't need to. "Beckett," the general said softly. "Ray," George replied. No one else existed for a moment. The general bent down and read the list. When he got to Miguel Alvarez, he stopped. "You carried him out yourself. I read the report, you know." George didn't respond right away. Then, he was barely 20. Kept photos of his dog in his helmet. "No problem, I remember. I signed off on his deployment." Ray's voice broke slightly at the end of the sentence, but he steadied it. He stepped back, then addressed the crowd that had started gathering without meaning to. "This man kept something alive that most of us forgot," General Maddox said. voice projecting with the ease of someone who'd spoken at too many funerals. He turned a list into a battalion of memories. These men weren't just names. They were friends, brothers, voices we used to hear around the fire, hands we used to grip before the chopper lifted off. He turned to George again. "I owe you more than thanks, the country does." George shook his head gently. "You owe them," he said, "not me." The general nodded, then turned back to the crowd. "I'm issuing a request to the city council. This spot should be officially renamed Beckett Memorial Garden, effective immediately." Gasps. Someone started clapping. Then everyone was... George sat still, unmoved. It wasn't pride that kept him quiet. It was something older than that. Respect, maybe, or grief that had learned to sit without flinching. Back at City Hall, Councilwoman Eliza Carrington sat watching a live video stream on her office computer. Her inbox was full of messages, some praising her, others demanding she take action for failing to recognize Beckett's significance earlier. She didn't flinch. She knew bureaucracy, knew it moved slow until someone forced it to move fast. And this was a firestorm. An emergency meeting was called for Sunday morning. The press would be watching. Veterans groups had already promised to show up in numbers, and Eliza, usually meticulous and deliberate, found herself searching through city records at 2 a.m, looking for permits, citations, anything tied to George Beckett's property or public activity. She found something. Parking citation from 4 years ago. Written by Officer Dylan Merritt. Violation, aesthetic disruption of public-facing property. Attached photo, George's truck parked near the memorial with a slightly rusted bumper and a visible dent on the rear panel. It had been cited for public blight. Eliza's stomach turned. She printed the record and closed her laptop. Sunday arrived cold and clear. The community hall was filled to capacity. The flags were folded and unfurled again. Local veterans stood in uniform along the back wall, silently bearing witness. A photo of the list, framed and centered, sat on an easel beside the podium. Dylan Merritt stood in the far corner, head bowed low. He wasn't wearing his uniform. Councilwoman Carrington took the podium. "We gather here today because of a man who didn't ask for recognition, who didn't ask for anything, really, except the dignity of memory. And this city, this council, fell short." She held up the printed citation, still folded, still sharp. "This is a record I personally authorized. I was wrong. We were wrong." Murmurs swept the crowd. This list, this grocery list, was never meant to be judged. It was meant to be honored. And from this day forward, we will honor it. I am formally motioning for the following. 1. A public apology to Mr. George Beckett from this council. 2. The expungement of all past code violations tied to his name. And 3. The dedication of the Center Street Memorial Garden to be renamed the George Beckett Veterans Tribute Garden. Applause thundered, long and heartfelt. Dylan slipped quietly out the back door, but not before stopping beside George, who was seated near the aisle. "I didn't know," Dylan said quietly, his voice raw. I didn't look. I just saw a man with paper and figured I was wrong." George didn't look at him, but he did say one thing. "You can't always go back, but you can stand still long enough to notice what's right in front of you." Dylan swallowed hard and nodded. Then he left. Outside, beneath the new sign already staked in place, a small girl named Ella placed a bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the list. Her grandfather, who once served with George in the same division, stood behind her with watery eyes. "What does it mean?" she asked. Her grandfather looked down, voice quiet. "It means somebody remembered." George Beckett stood in the sunlight, hat in hand, as children from the local elementary school filed past him with curiosity in their eyes and silence in their steps. They weren't told to be quiet, they simply knew. The air around the memorial had changed in the past week. It no longer felt like a stone garden that people passed without glancing at. It felt alive, reverent. The laminated list now stood in a custom glass case beneath a bronze plaque freshly installed. It read, "In honor of those who never got a second chance. Maintained by Sergeant George Beckett, U.S. Army." He didn't cry. George hadn't cried since 1971, when they folded up Skip Mather's flag and handed it to a sister who couldn't stop shaking. But something shifted in his chest that morning. Something he had kept locked behind years of routine and quiet rituals. He heard the clack of dress shoes on pavement before he saw her. Councilwoman Carrington approached, wearing a dark blue blazer and a smile that didn't feel like a politician's anymore. "Mr. Beckett," she said softly, "it's official now. The city has designated this as a historical site. Veterans groups have agreed to help maintain it, and the schools will include your list in their civic education programs. Every name here will be taught to the next generation." George didn't answer. Instead, he handed her a small photograph. Faded, torn at the corners, it showed a row of young men in fatigues, crouched together in front of a Huey helicopter, grinning like fools who thought they'd live forever. "They were just boys," he said. "Some didn't even shave yet, but they stood up when their names were called." Eliza took the photo carefully, like it might crumble in her hands. "Would you be willing to speak at the dedication next week?" "I'll be here," George replied, "but I won't be talking. That's their time, not mine." She nodded. She understood. Across the street, a mural was going up on the side of Harper's Market. Maggie Rowe had volunteered the wall, and the town had voted to commission a local artist named Brian Teller, a veteran of Desert Storm turned painter, to bring it to life. The mural featured hands holding a folded flag, a list of names flying like a banner, and in the background, George's unmistakable figure sitting on the bench. It was the first time he'd ever agreed to be painted. The grocery store now kept a copy of the list taped near the checkout. Underneath it, in Maggie's handwriting, a note read, "These aren't groceries, these are Guardian." Even Officer Dylan Merritt had changed, subtly at first. He no longer gave out citations for dented trucks or unpainted mailboxes. He had requested reassignment to the Veterans Affairs Liaison Program after attending one of the ceremonies. No one asked why, but everyone noticed when he started helping old men load their groceries without being asked. The list continued to grow, not in names of the fallen, but in the number of people who asked to help carry it. Local students began doing weekly readings of the names during morning announcements. A woman in town created a small website to tell the stories behind each one. Family members wrote in, sharing letters, photos, memories that George never expected to see again. One Sunday morning, a boy no older than 10 sat next to George on the bench. "My grandpa was in Vietnam, too," he said shyly. "He doesn't talk about it, but I think he'd like you." George chuckled, slow and low. "Tell your grandpa I'd like to talk about the things we don't talk about." The boy looked confused, but he smiled and nodded, running back to his parents with excitement. Later that day, George took a walk farther than usual, not to the store, not to the VFW, but to the town square where a new flagpole had been erected. There, under the bronze statue of a saluting soldier, was a new addition, an engraved granite bench. It read simply, "Dedicated to Sergeant George Beckett, because remembering is a form of service." He stood in front of it a long time. When he sat, his knees ached, but his heart didn't. As the wind rustled the leaves and the flag above him snapped in salute to the sky, George finally allowed himself to breathe fully. He had carried them long enough. Now the town carried them too. That night he drove home with the windows down. No radio, just the sound of wind and memory. He parked the truck in his usual spot by the memorial, not because he had to anymore, but because he still wanted to. As he reached for the laminated list to fold and bring inside, he noticed something new. A single sheet of paper tucked underneath, written in crayon. It said, "Dear Mr. Beckett, thank you for remembering the soldiers. My dad says you're the bravest man in our town. I want to be like you when I grow up." It wasn't signed with a full name, just Mason, age 7. George held the note to his chest, and this time he let the tears come. Not from pain, not from grief, but because the silence he had lived with for so long was finally being filled, not with noise, but with voices that understood what it meant to remember. George Beckett never stopped carrying the list, but now, for the first time, he didn't carry it alone.